That's the same thing with the vaccines. I've discovered, like, there's no question that the science behind vaccines and how it works, but there's also no question that some people cannot process them if they're on overload.
Yeah.
Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Disruptor, the show where we challenge outdated medical norms and redefine what true wellness looks like. I'm bringing you the innovators, the boundary breakers, and the trailblazers who refuse to accept the status quo. These disruptors are revolutionizing the way we approach wellness so that you can feel better, live healthier, and take back control of your health. Today's episode, we have Dr. Jill Carnahan, who started right off the bat as a medical disruptor. Not like me, that was one way and then eventually became a disruptor. She went into med school as a disruptor, and she attributes it to her years growing up on a farm. Unfortunately, she thinks that's also the reason for her breast cancer years later. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time of this podcast. You're not going to want to miss this one. Dr. Jill, I am so excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here. I love the title of your podcast and I cannot wait to dive in.
Thank you. Which leads me right to my first question, because usually I have guests who are like, they started off one way, like myself, and then they had an aha moment, and then they became disruptors. But you said that you went into this being a disruptor. Tell me more.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in Central Illinois, one of 5 kids. My mom was a nurse who retired to take care of all of us and kind of had a much more holistic mindset. We had an organic garden. We grew some of our own food. We went to the doctor when we were sick, but we certainly didn't do that as like a first line. It was more like, maybe there's some chicken soup or some herbs. And if the things would get better, then of course we saw doctors and everything. But the mentality growing up was we knew that the food nourished our bodies and that our bodies had the potential to heal. And so I kind of grew up with this mentality. And often as a preventative, I saw a chiropractor, acupuncturist. So that was the framework. And I never in a million years would have thought I'd go into allopathic medical, traditional medicine. So even in college, I was studying, biochemistry, undergraduate and bioengineering. And I thought I was going to do like chiropractic, acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, some sort of kind of allied, alternative, integrative, more holistic minded. But what happened was I always wanted to keep my options open. And so I started applying. And then I was like, there's 7 schools in Illinois. There are medical schools. Why don't I apply just for fun?
Sure,
And
let's run
started
that. Who
applying.
doesn't on a Tuesday apply to
Yeah,
stuff?
I always wanted to keep the options. I'm like, why don't I try? But there was no one. I mean, my dad was a farmer. His dad was a farmer. This was like not, my mom was a nurse. So in that sense, a caretaker healer for sure. But
Adjacent.
no medical doctors in my family. So here's the
Whoa.
deal. I started applying and my first acceptance was from Loyola. I later got accepted to almost everywhere I applied, but it was like, oh, wait, that was the aha moment. What if I could actually go into regular conventional medicine and learn the best system, not the best system, the best reimbursable system in the US? Because if I wanted to go overseas or do anything, there was this language of, how it is, the silly hierarchy that we have. And I
Yeah.
thought, I want to get the best training that we have in the US for our system currently. But I want to go in with my, one eye open and kind of take the good, like trauma and acute heart attack. And how do we treat these kind of things? But then also be open to what else is possible. So I really went in kind of as a rebel. And what happened is at Loyola, they'd never had anything like it. I formed the first integrative medical club at the time. We brought in traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and the faculty and the students were able to kind of get this exposure to other disciplines that actually had incredible science. And so I feel like I was one of the rebels in medical school.
Yes, you were.
Showed the light to the faculty and the students of, wait, this isn't, they still thought I was a little weird. And it was neat because it was the foundation of how I see medicine.
This is amazing. And you actually touch on a few things I like to surface, if that's the right
Sure.
moment, because your story is fascinating. First of all, a woman in that generation with no background, that's already disruptive. Like, I'm not even going there, but already kudos to you. Thank you for breaking barriers for all of us.
Thank you.
But also, when I give my gaslighting speech, I talk about the fact that doctors don't mean to gaslight. It's indoctrination from thinking that evidence-based medicine is the only toolbox. But you came in knowing that it was only one toolbox, as opposed to getting indoctrinated and then unlearning. And I wonder if that's because you came from such a natural background, like the farmers and understanding that. And so you knew, I recently had someone on a podcast who said, all of this stuff has been working for thousands of years. Allopathic medicine has only been around for a few years. So do you think it's because of your kind of natural background from the earth background that you kind of knew this is just one toolbox?
Yeah, I mean, my dad and brother are like engineers of the soil. So they look at biochemistry and they look at magnesium, calcium ratios and nitrogen, and they're growing these crops and they actually test. And it's almost like a reflection of our bodies. And I always used to say like autoimmunity begins in our gut and our microbiome. But more recently, I've been like, it begins in our soils. So it's such like you said, it is absolutely a trajectory that goes from soil to microbiome to health. And now more than ever before, as the massive amount of information comes out about our soils, about the health of our soils, about how we produce food, and then about our gut microbiome and that reflection, I'm like, oh my gosh, 20 some years ago when I was on the farm growing up, this insight into maybe these are connected has been shown now with science.
Yeah,
So yes is the answer.
it's
And I'll never
crazy.
forget, like my mom would take me to a chiropractor and that was kind of like a preventative adjustment, but he talked about nutrition. And when I was probably 10, he sent me home with this first line therapy book on nutrition. And I like devoured it. And it was all about how the food that we eat changes our health and can be the foundation. So I remember being like, wow, this is so cool. I want to be like a dietitian or a nutritionist, or
Yes.
I kind of went that direction initially because I was so fascinated with food and how it affects our cells.
I can't tell you, I'm just like, as you're speaking, how I'm like, I'm having my own aha moments. And I love this with my guests because when my wife got really sick, we were both in conventional medicine. And when they suggested that her psoriasis and PMLE has to do with nutrition, we were like, that's crazy. That's nonsense.
Right.
It's nonsense. And so we had to like get there. But you came from, wow, you described like, would you say it's engineers of the soil?
Yeah, so they literally are like my brother, literally farmers from all over regional Midwestern come to
Really?
him for advice because I always say he's like the functional medicine guy of the soil. Like he really goes into the depth of what's causing plants to grow or not grow. He checks antioxidant capacity in some of the
What?
soils and they're mapping out to the square inch of like moisture and nitrogen content. And so it's really cool because they use the science in actually creating a soil that creates healthy food, that creates
Oh
healthy
my
guts, that
God.
yeah.
So of
And that
course,
was like, we both kind of parallel. I mean, we didn't plan it obviously, but we
oh
both
my,
had that same like curious mindset. And I'm sure you and your wife had the same as to ultimately, I think it comes down to being curious because if
curious.
we end up graduating from medical school and then we're like, oh, we've learned everything we need to know. And docs like that, right?
All
You have to
day.
be curious that to say what else is possible. And is there something more that I might not have learned?
What an incredible foundation to have that. I almost feel like everyone should go become a farmer first, prerequisite to go into med school.
Yeah.
Wow, because then of course that's going to affect, of course it's gonna affect your thyroid if your selenium is low. Because look, I'm just like the connection that like my brain is like braining right now. Okay, this is amazing. Which
Well,
also
and I have to mention a really
tell
quick
me,
comment. You just shared the story of you getting diagnosed, or was it your wife? When your wife
my
was
wife,
saying,
yeah.
so the diagnosis and then the idea that nutrition, and then being like disbelief, right? I had a very bizarre experience that was almost the opposite. So I had cancer at 25, and then
Mm.
right after my cancer, I had Crohn's disease. I remember going to the gastroenterologist and talking to him, and he's, Jill, this is lifelong. You're going to need drugs and surgery. You're going to need immune modulating drugs. You're going to need steroids right now, and you're probably going to have part of your colon removed, and it's incurable. And I was just like, okay. And I'm like 30 medical student. So of course, we don't have that much confidence. Cool. But right before I left, I'll never forget. I was just like, I have one question. Does diet have anything to do with this? Is there anything I could do with my diet for the Crohn's? Because I'm willing to do whatever. He literally didn't even pause. And he's like, Jill, diet has nothing to do with Crohn's disease. Right? I start hearing this still, and I just had to prove him wrong because of course it did. And I cured him. I don't have Crohn's anymore. I'm 20 years later, no Crohn's. And diet was the start of the cure. So,
I'm in pain. I'm in pain from like of all the diseases to tell people other than nutrition. You're gonna talk
right.
about the intestinal tract
Yeah.
that processes your food. How could you say it has nothing to do with diet? This gets me every time. Till this
But it
day.
also shows the training we had because we were trained in the same schools that indoctrinated that, oh, diet has, and if it did, patients won't talk about their diet, right? Like you can't
Yeah.
change a patient's diet.
Yeah, you can't
So,
change it. I remember the first time I almost got kicked out of a dermatological conference because I had the audacity to suggest that anecdotally, all the children in my practice, eczema was reversed when we removed dairy from their life. And they were like, no, do not start eliminating foods and
right.
creating elimination diet. I'm like, but their skin looks better.
But it's better.
It's better. I
Like
know
we're
there's no
observing
study.
science, right? Because that's how science starts is we observe a phenomenon. We're like, I wonder if there's some connection here,
And
right?
it's replicatable. And I keep
Yeah.
repeating it all the thing. I just don't have the funding for the study. Who's funding this? Nobody. Oh my God, this is crazy. Oh
Yeah.
my God, I'm loving talking to you. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to get from like this part of the soil background that you have and the fact that I mean, you shine in so many places, but like your jam is around environmental toxins.
Yeah.
That's an overwhelming topic for anyone listening. Give us the overwhelm and then give us the bad news and then tell us
Yeah.
how to eat this in bite size.
Okay. I love that you said that because I remember years ago hearing one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Roundtree, talk about
Yes.
environmental toxicity. And I would be like, It's all doom and gloom, but it's not. I promise we'll get to the good news. The truth is, we are all swimming in toxic soup. The air that we breathe, 80% of our environmental toxic load comes from the air that we breathe, nanoparticulate from exhaust, toxins from mold in our buildings that we live in or walk in or work in or cars, and just so many places that we're not seeing or understanding the water that we drink. The plastics now are a huge issue. And unless we are conscious of this environmental effect that's literally exponentially increasing our risk of autoimmunity, heart disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancers, then we are not aware and we're behind the eight ball, we could say. So I feel like it's such an important thing to be aware because there's choices that don't cost a lot of money and don't take a lot of change that you can daily incorporate. And I always like to frame it with, first of all, just knowing that you have a toxic load and starting with your air. And I always say clean air, clean water, clean food. And those things, you don't even need a doctor to start, like making sure you have a good air filtration. I say like a MERV 16 or higher in your furnace filter, start there. That's just an easy replacement. Replace it every 3 months. Get a standalone filter that does HEPA particulate, and then that also has a VOC filter, things like Austin Air, IQ Air, Doctor. There's a ton out there. And what you want is something that has a core that has carbon or zeolite, which will also filter out things like formaldehyde, gases, particulate, even this, like with the wildfires that LA has had and everywhere. That particulate 2.5 and below is so toxic because when we breathe that particulate that fine into our alveoli, there's no barrier. So it goes directly into our bloodstream. It's too small for any sort of cellular filtration. So because of that, the air that we breathe, especially after wildfires, in a moldy home, in an exhaust-filled environment by the airport, by the roadways, a new house, off gases, all these materials, we need to have our air filtered. And I'm such a fan. I have 3 in my small condo. I have 5 at my workplace because I want to breathe clean air. So clean air is huge. Clean water, you want to just make sure you're not using plastic water bottles. We know now the microplastics are creating, I think the average human consumes 1 credit card worth of plastic per week. That's
Oh my God. That's a
insane.
crazy number.
And they're finding it in neurofibular tangles in the brain. They're finding it in plaques in the arteries. So plastic's a huge issue. So trying to, the kind of thing you use in your dishwasher, make sure there's no plastic in those little pods, and make sure that you're not using plastic water bottles. You're using glass or aluminum or stainless steel, even better. So those are the things: clean water, clean air, and clean food. And then clean food, choosing local, organic when possible, avoiding some of the really toxic foods like farmed fish. A lot of times has microplastics and mercury. And again, it can be overwhelming, but there are things that are fairly accessible and affordable for everyone. For example, even an air filter might cost $600-800. You can make a box air filter, Google it on YouTube, with a fan and a box. Like, it's pretty simple, probably cost you $50 from Home Depot. So there's
Wow.
ways to do these things that are not super expensive and out of touch for the average American.
I love that. I think all those things you mentioned, especially, if you can't afford like a crazy HEPA filter, get that filter that you can get and change it yourself every 3 months.
Mhm.
Because how many people don't change their filters at all? And so
That's it, right? We've been,
there.
it's been 8 years.
It's been a year. Like, I have a filter. I remember the first time when I was much, much younger, I was like, what? There's filter in the AC? Okay, so those are really good. You know what comes to mind, and maybe this is an out there question, but you did say I could ask you anything.
Yes.
Uh, there are so many cosmetic things, and what about, people are using fillers and Botox? Is there any room for that at all if we're trying to have clean living?
Okay, I love this topic because a little tip of my story that I snuck in there, but I didn't talk a lot about, was I'm third-year medical student in my surgical rotation. We're taught breast exams. I'm 24, just about to be 25. I'm like, okay, let's check. I find a lump in my breast.
Whoa.
And within a week or 2, I had an ultrasound. I had a mammogram. It was highly suspicious, but they're still like, you're 24, right?
Right.
2 weeks later, after the biopsy, I get a call from the surgeon, and she
Yeah.
said, Jill, I don't know how to tell you this. You have aggressive breast cancer.
Be quiet.
25. It was like a week or 2 after my 25th birthday.
No.
And at that time in Loyola in Chicago, where I went to medical school, now this has since changed, but in 2001, when I was diagnosed, had the honor of being the youngest woman at Loyola ever diagnosed with breast cancer. So back to the
Oh my
farm and the chemicals, but here's the deal about what you said about body and bath and everything. After I had the breast cancer, part of my curious nature was, why did this happen? What could be
Hmm.
going on? And we already framed the farm as this idyllic Norman Rockwell-esque, a beautiful place. But the truth is, there was also a double-edged sword because
Sure.
in the 80s, when I grew up, there was still pesticides, herbicides, and many of them are endocrine disruptors. And
Oh
if you
my
look
God.
at, so these were things what that means is they have an estrogen-like effect in the body. And this is why chemicals in general are part of that toxic load that we need to think about. And I'm coming back around to cosmetics, I promise.
Okay, I'm not.
But
This is. I'm like
so
my mouth is open. Yeah.
so important because what I started to do is say, okay, what happened? And I thought, oh my goodness, atrazine still being used in the US, it's banned in the European Union. It is a known endocrine disruptor to the nth degree. I mean, there's so much data on frogs whose wastewater had atrazine turned into ambiguous genitalia. They didn't know if they were
Get
male or
out.
female because of this effect of the sex hormones. And so this thing is happening, and we still on the farm, just like all the farmers in the Midwest, were using atrazine. And I remember looking it up on a map and seeing the layout of density of application. And right where I grew up, it's like the brightest, hottest spot in all of the Midwest because that was cornfields of the Illinois Midwestern black dark soil, and
Whoa.
they still use atrazine. So it was pretty much a high. And then the other thing I realized is bath and body, makeup, hair products, so many things young women put on their hair and face and that. And nowadays, I mean, you name it, I won't name the big box stores, but most of us have an average of about 200 products we use on a weekly basis,
100%.
men and women. So it's not
100%.
women, right?
Yeah.
And these things, the transdermal, the biggest area of medications that are coming on down the pipeline are transdermal because we can absorb so much through our skin.
Sure. We
So
get our,
when I
our
realized,
hormones this way now, and
yeah, so many
just
patches and creams and things. So I really had an aha a few years after the breast cancer. I was like, oh, my beauty, makeups, soaps, perfumes, everything makes a difference. And I just clean things up. There's a couple databases. There's one called Skin Deep that's free. There's one called from Environmental Working Group. And you can Think Dirty is another one. And you can actually look
mm,
up your products and see the score. So I started cleaning up my regimen. And now I'd say bath and body products are real clean, but things like parabens, phthalates, PCBs, all in our products are having an effect. So that's just the stuff we put on hair, makeup, whatever. But you ask about actually fillers, cosmetics, all of that. I do think that there is a real issue, the more stuff. And what we're seeing now is people who have over lasered and they're having fat atrophy that's permanent, like they're getting distorted faces or they're getting so much filler that they look so unnatural. I do believe that neurotoxins, which is Botox and all the ones like that, people ask about like autoimmunity and stuff. I've not really seen that be a trigger for most people, but still, how much excessive stuff do you want to put in your body? So by all means, if you want to age gracefully, which I do, it's better to do things like red light therapy or cold plunge, or just the dietary cleanness of your diet makes such a difference on the skin. Your liver health makes a difference on the skin. So I'd much rather go from inside out and then do some of the things like red light that we know are more natural. Thing I like and I think is very safe is the microneedling with a real low
mm,
level, and then using like PRP, which is your own platelets. That's a really nice kind of gentle, I think as about as biological as it comes because it's your own blood product.
yeah.
I do that regularly. I love that. But other than that, I think you are going into more dangerous territory as far as what you put in your body. If you must, there are safer fillers, like hyaluronic acid is a much more biological than some of the synthetics. So if someone really feels strongly, at
Yeah.
least use something that is not synthetic.
That's it's so interesting to say. Like, even it's interesting what you said about the Botox also, or toxins,
Mhm.
because it's also you're saying you haven't found a link, granted, but I
Yeah.
think there that conversation of this thing will make your cup run over, right? If you have
Yes,
all these
yes,
things and you just add one more thing, so some things are unavoidable in your life, so you kind of have to leave room for them. And if you're going to
right,
add more things, you have to detoxify. Like, you're asking your body, all your detoxification organs, to work that much harder, and so it's risk reward. Which kind of brings me even to, and I'm not even going to talk to delve too into it because I don't want to get too out there. But that's the same thing with the vaccines. I've discovered, like, there's no question that the science behind vaccines and how it works, but there's also no question that some people cannot process them if they're on overload.
yeah.
And
I
so,
always say it's like a stress test, right? You are walking around, your heart is just fine. You don't know there's anything wrong. You get on a treadmill, you do the Bruce protocol, you amp up that level and you're going and you're having,
mm,
all of a sudden your T wave changes and you're like, the doc's, hey, you're going to have a heart attack. Let's take you to get a cath. You would never reveal that defect had you not stressed the heart. And I think take 1,000 kids, you're going to have 5 of them, maybe 10 of them that have genetic defects that don't detox aluminum and some of the adjuvants. Well, those are there to stimulate the immune system and create immune response. So
yeah,
that's very deliberate. However, that 1 or 2 or 5% of kiddos that cannot detox and maybe have also had mold in their home. And it's that level, I was thinking of it like a bucket where the toxic load gets above here and then we can't tolerate it. And what happens is a vaccine isn't bad, it's effective, the science is good, but there's a small percentage of kiddos or adults that reach that threshold with that extra ingredient and they
yes,
can't detox it. So I love how you said that because it's not a bad thing. I am so not against it. But there's a subpopulation that has been affected because their detox is not the same.
Yeah, and instead of suppressing, if we could have the conversation and put resources to finding
And
that
what can we
population.
test kiddos, right? Like maybe
Yeah,
we
if we
could
could
start.
test and say,
Mhm.
"This is not for you, this is," we could still achieve
Yeah,
that
right.
herd immunity that we're also worried about, but also protect those who need the
Yeah.
protection instead of pretending it doesn't happen. Oh, yes, I'm so with you.
Love it.
So with you, so with you.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so this brings us all of this kind of brings us to, I don't know which way to go. For should I go to liver health? Should I go about mold? Because my patients love talking about mold
Oh,
and my
yeah.
audience. You choose. Where should we
Let's
go next?
do both because I can pull them together.
Do it. Let's do it.
I always have a story because for some reason the universe has given me like a guinea
I
pig
love your
experience,
story.
breast cancer, Crohn's disease. So I learned the gut and then I learned cancer. And then, well, so I was doing fine after cancer and Crohn's. I moved to Boulder to start my practice in 2010. I was running marathons and like living life and doing well in my late 30s. And I had this office in Boulder, and unbeknownst to me, there was mold growing below my office in a crawl space that had standing water. And then there was a massive flood in Boulder, 2013. It was called the Thousand-Year Flood. We had so much, like almost $1 billion of damage to homes and everything. And that was a catalyst for this mold to really get aggressive. And it was Stachybotrys, probably some other
Mm.
ones. Well, didn't know it, but I started going downhill, shortness of breath, rashes all over, red eyes, trouble with cough, congestion, immune system, and on lots of histamine responses. And finally, I was brave enough to say, what if this is something in my environment? And I did testing in the basement with a inspector, and I did testing for my own urine, and I found the same type. Stachybotrys bulk sample in the basement was positive, and in my urine was trichosethines, which are from Stachy. And I was like, okay, this is an issue. And what happened then was in a journey that I was, you could say, forced. It ended up being a blessing, but I became the mold expert. I had to figure out how to heal myself. And then in that journey, I really started to understand. So mold is really surprisingly common, and it can trigger an innate immune response. So we all in medical school, again, we're taught, talk about disruptor. We're taught about this adaptive response. That's this like allergic. So we know that mold's an allergen. Everybody knows that. And
And
any
that's it.
allergist is going to test, skin test, mold is out for some people, right?
Yeah.
That's one arm of the immune system. But what we're talking about is the innate arm, which is the arm. Thank goodness for COVID in some ways, because during the pandemic, all of a sudden on the nightly news was cytokines
Yes.
and immune
So
response. And I
right.
think the general population started to understand this. So many people are a little bit familiar because in COVID, it's the same thing. That virus rarely killed someone. The virus triggering immune response and your own innate cycling of a vicious cycle of cytokine storm was usually what caused death or disability from that disease, but it was your own immune system. Mold is very similar. So you have this exogenous toxin. And for example, say we had mold growing behind this wall, that mold might be undisturbed back there. It's growing, it's gross, whatever. But it's the mycotoxin that produced that can go right through the wall, into my alveoli, into my bloodstream within seconds because it's less than 2.5 microns. And it's these mycotoxins that actually trigger this immune response that we can't clear. And it can be the big things we see is mast cell activation. So that would be all kinds of systems, but this excessive histamine, prostaglandin, pain issues, brain fog issues, neurocognitive issues, skin rashes, lots of gut issues, heartburn. I could go on and on because almost every system is affected. The most common is fatigue and brain fog, which can be anything, right? It's real
Yes.
generic. But many times, if you take a great history and you're saying, well, when did you last feel
Yeah.
well?
When I
And someone's
moved
like,
to my new
well,
house, when I
yeah,
moved here.
exactly. And then you hear the story of, and then you say, does anyone else in your family have issues? My son just developed asthma last year and he had fun. So there's these clues of, and not everyone has an experience. So you can have a house full of people and two of them are extremely sick and two of them are fine. So that's what's confusing too,
Because
is
then
our
you're
immune system.
really crazy and just sensitive. Or in a
Right. And
workplace where you're the only person and everyone else is fine. So you're just like always calling
yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. So it
Love this.
does I mean, it's more so I, again, got very sick from it and was able to heal. But back to the liver. So then what happens? So if you think about this, so say again, there's mold behind the wall. I always think of it like the analogy of a fire and smoke. So if I had a fire in the middle of my room here, it's burning the carpet, I put it out and then I tear out the carpet and replace it and everything. That's the equivalent of is if you take out the mold spores behind your wall, you clean up, you remediate, you cut out material that's 2 feet margins. That's all great. But that fire was producing smoke, and your curtains and your books and your other parts of your carpet, your
Wow.
blankets and your bed,
Good.
they might smell like smoke, right? So you have to remediate. You have to really clean that smoke out of the materials in your house. And when people remediate from mold, that's usually the biggest mistake because they take out, remediate the mold. But that smoke damage, which is the equivalent of those mycotoxins, often is ignored. And people will
Mm.
stay ill because the mycotoxins are in their books or in their clothing or in their mattress. So usually I have people do the remediation and keep it completely contained with air filtration so it's not contaminating the house, then clean their HVAC system, and then do a fog with a fog that brings down all particulate to surfaces, like a dry fog, and then clean really well, wipe every surface in the place. And that will usually get people to a place where they feel
Wow.
well back into that environment.
That's a really good point. I've never heard that before about like you remediate the mold and then I know
Yeah.
that you remediate the person,
Yeah.
but I never considered the other surfaces.
Yeah. And often
That's
if there
novel.
is someone who says, "I remediated, I still don't feel well," usually that's the issue is the smoke, which is the mycotoxin equivalent, is still some in their house, and a fog and a clean will often get someone to that next level.
Amazing. So then if we remediate the home and environment, the next thing we have to do is then detoxify your body.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where the
So
liver comes in because
yes,
if we think about this, so we're inhaling that and those little tiny particulate could literally go alveoli direct into bloodstream. They get stored in tissues like any fat soluble toxin. And so part of any detox is mobilization and then excretion. And we first have to mobilize it out of our tissues, things like glutathione, Epsom salt baths, infrared sun, anything that's mobilizing tissues, octinate, pectisol, some of these things that are binders or movers of toxins is the first step to get that mobilized out of the tissues. And what happens is it actually goes back into the blood, be filtered by the kidneys and the liver. It can be sweated out by the skin. We can exhale it out through the lungs. So all of our organs that are contributing to detox. But the liver is a big one because typically that's filtering the blood. We have phase one, phase two, and it takes that valuable toxin from the tissues into an intermediate and then into a water soluble toxin, which is excreted then into the gallbladder and sticks in the bile. And the bile is typically squeezed out with our meals and between meals, and it goes into the stool. But what happens is we're really efficient at reabsorbing that so we can reuse the bile acids. And so if we don't disrupt that with a binder like clay or charcoal or chlorella or glycomannan, and they all have different charges, so they'll kind of grab onto that toxic load and pull it out through the stool. And sweating's another way, kidneys filter, so all of our filtration systems. But that liver tends to be a primary place of where we focus. So typically we'll give patients glutathione, liposomal, IV, or whatever source. You can even do it nebulized and you get glutathione into the system to help mobilize. And then I always give liver support, things like milk thistle, alpha lipoic acid, NAC, to support that liver, methylated B vitamins, and then you want a binder. And the binder is usually empty stomach, out with your stool.
I love that you just described phase one, phase two conjugation in like the easiest way. Thank you so much. I mean,
Welcome.
detoxification process.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Anyone listening, if you're dealing with mold, please don't do this on your own. Please
Yeah.
find a guide detoxifying. And it's interesting that, right? Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I would.
You
Yeah.
need a guide to
Mhm.
walk you through this, and this could take time. And if you're feeling unwell while you're doing it, it's probably
Yeah.
moving too fast. Just as an aside, if I see someone who is coming for other reasons, and they tell me that every time they have glutathione, they don't feel well.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, "Okay, what do we have on board?"
Yeah.
It's almost like a smoke detector. That's something
I couldn't agree more. It's like even in my journey getting well, first 2 years I couldn't take glutathione. I would get hives and stuff because it was and if you think about when I started thinking about mobilization excretion, it made everything understandable because mobilization is actually pretty easy. Just give some glutathione and move the body, sweat, detox. But if you mobilize quicker than you can excrete, then you get sick. So what you're describing is this mobilization is upregulated and they're not excreting. And excreting's a little harder because typically it's lymphatic drainage, maybe massage, maybe Epsom salt baths. It's not typically just a pill or a supplement. It takes a little more work, and often you have to go at the rate at which you can excrete. So you just have to pull back on not metabolize or mobilizing too quickly.
Yeah, so you're now reacting to the glutathione,
Right.
reacting to this mobilization. That's a really good point. So now you're speaking this coming month about
Yeah.
liver.
Uh-huh.
What are you gonna tell us about liver?
So the liver, it's funny because I went to Switzerland a couple different times for a retreat in the medical clinic there, Swiss Mountain Clinic, and I love the way the German and Swiss doctors talk. They're like, liver is queen, and they just
Ooh,
I know, right? Like liver is the queen, and almost like Rodney Dangerfield, it doesn't get much respect because we in medical school, liver doesn't get any
I know.
like no like big cool,
Whatever, I can regrow,
yeah.
but I don't care.
We just assume it's doing its job, whereas like our, pituitary maybe or our brain or like our heart, that gets all the respect in that, or even our
So true.
ovaries or
So true. Nephrocardio, big fight, but
right?
liver,
Hematologists, they don't get no
yeah,
credit.
so true.
But I really have grown to love and respect the liver is such a hardworking organ because we get exposed to so much toxicity. So This is where it all happens. It is the ground zero. And if your liver's not healthy, everything else goes sideways. And now we know there's a huge connection to the gut because endotoxemia, which is the coating of bacteria from our microbiome, if we have a leaky gut and that leaks into the bloodstream, first stop is liver. And that's the main cause of fatty liver, metabolic syndrome, obesity. A lot of the things we see as chronic diseases are really liver related things and microbiome related things. So the way to help there is you really start with the gut because the gut, if it's too permeable or there's dysbiosis, bacterial overgrowth, fungal overgrowth, all of that will contribute to the toxic load. We started out by talking about exotoxins. Those are things outside, chemicals, atrazine, pesticides, parabens, phthalates. But we also have endotoxins, which are inside our body from the yeast in our gut, the bacteria in our gut, any other infections we might have, even like our own hormones if they're not detoxified properly. So we can actually have internal toxins that contribute to this toxic load and especially stress out our livers.
First of all, I love that they made the liver
I
female,
know, right?
and because obviously she's the hardworking one, and
Right?
so many
Yeah.
reasons doing all they're doing.
Uh,
Let me ask you a question. Why do you think, and everyone has different reasons, and maybe they're all the same reasons. Why do you think our colleagues still think what we're saying is quackery?
yeah.
With all
Such a
this
great
evidence,
question.
why do you think there's an entire world of people that you'll still mention this over dinner and they're like,
Yeah.
"What are you doing, Jill?"
What are you talking about? Right. I have another thought about that I'm going to hold for a second, but the first thing that comes to mind is we started out with talking about curiosity, and I think there's two types. I'm being very general. There's way more than this, but in general, there's like type that thinks they graduate from medical school, they've learned everything, and there's a big ego. And so they can't
Mm.
they think no one else can possibly know something that I haven't been taught, right? When you bring up a topic that they've never heard of, they're like, either you're crazy or I'm stupid. And they don't want to believe they're stupid.
Ah,
So they believe
that's
you're crazy,
crazy.
right?
Oh, I like that.
So that's one type. The other type is hopefully you and I want to be this in the world is curious. And all of our great Thomas Edison and all the great thinkers and inventors, the hallmark of genius is curiosity.
Mm.
And I'm awful and humbled by that because I do believe I'm curious. I think you're curious too. That's what a disruptor is. What
Absolutely.
happen if we but there's a piece of that too that is a humility about my own limitations and like, oh, and even like on podcasts, whether I'm on with you or someone else is on my podcast, I love learning. And I always go on with like, can I learn? And so there's a humility of knowing like I don't know everything. And if I just come with that curiosity, I always learn the coolest things and meet the coolest people.
I
But
agree.
that's the difference is someone who thinks they already know everything, and if they're challenged and defensive by your questioning what they know or bringing up something they don't know. And then there's the other type that's like, "Oh, how can I learn from you?" And unfortunately, I think our traditional medical system breeds the former.
I think you are 100% right. And I learn from other people, and I also learn a lot from my patients.
Yes.
So
Oh,
much.
that's it. Isn't that the biggest thing? Every day I'm like, "Oh my goodness." I'm like, "Oh, tell me more about that thing that helped you." Like, just
Yeah.
I get so many tips from my patient.
I was just in an exam room with one of my patients, and she had this like really interesting ring, and I'm like, "What is that ring?" I forgot the name of it, but it's like a
Aura probably,
fidget.
right? No.
It was a fidget ring, and I was like,
Oh,
"Why do you
cool.
have this?" Because it was a really interesting shape, and she said, "It helped me stop bite my nails because."
Cool.
And it does like all these things, and there's like a whole
Uh-huh.
world. And I was like, "What a great concept!" And it's
That's cool.
designed to help you like overcome certain impulses.
That's
But it's
amazing.
very low tech, there's no technology in it,
Yeah.
it's shaped a certain way and lets you fidget, and I was like,
That's
"I'm so glad
cool.
I woke up today." So, yeah, it's from the small to the profound, but it's really wonderful. Is there anything you wanna tell our shared audience that maybe I haven't asked you?
With everything that's changing in our world so rapidly, I think information is going to become so accessible. It already is, but more and more. You're not going to have to go to the expert. You can actually find stuff yourself, which is good and bad because say you're like, okay, I can order my own MRI and I can see that I have
Mm,
cancer. There's a level of stuff that you may not be ready for, right? I wanted to just talk to the listener because this is going to happen whether we like it or not as medical professionals and as patients. And I think the important thing is to still collaborate and find someone who can kind of help you navigate because I'm all for patients getting their labs, patients being able to order things. I love that freedom that we're starting to embrace and getting information out there. But sometimes it's a lot. Like mold toxicity took me years to really understand, and I got way sicker before I got better. So I just want to encourage you that yes, you can get your information. Yes, you can treat yourself. Yes, you can start with clean air, clean water, clean food, but also partner with a coach, a doctor,
yes.
some other professional to kind of guide. Because even if you just need support, it's so important that we don't do this alone it's complex, and even for you and I who have medical training, it's still really complex.
It's so complex, and there's certain areas of my health that I give off to other guides, like,
Yes, yes.
I certainly understand my hormones, but I still have someone who helps guide me through it. And I think it's really important to find a guide,
Yeah.
even if sometimes to keep you on track. And so when things don't go right, sometimes you want to give up and you're like, no,
Right.
this is expected. Let's tweak it this way.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's so important to have a guide and collaboration. It should never be either or. It should never be
Yes.
like, I don't want this and I don't want to listen to this guy. Everyone has different tools for different things. So I
Exactly.
agree wholeheartedly. So where can our audience find you? What do you work with patients? Are you selling books? What's the mission?
Thank you. Everything I do is just I want to empower people and get inspire and empower. So I do have a lot of resources. My main website is just my name, which is Jill Carnahan, JILCARNAHAN.com, and everything you need, my podcast to the blog to resources, all there. If you want the book, that's called Unexpected: Finding Resilience Through Functional Medicine, Science and Face. You can find it on Amazon or anywhere you buy books. It's also on my main website. And if you really want to be inspired, I'm super excited because we did a documentary a couple years ago. It's now free streaming, and you can watch the documentary just if you're like, what is functional medicine? What can I
Mm.
do? We have my journey and journeys of some of my patients who've overcome severe illness, and I think it's pretty inspiring. Maybe I'm biased, but and you can see that at drpatientmovie.com. It's on Amazon Prime. It's on YouTube for free, so you can watch that documentary if you're interested in being inspired.
Oh, I love that. That's great. A lot of people don't know where to start. What is functional medicine? That's a great like intro. I love that so much. This is great. And your stories, I was like, it was like bedtime stories, but it's fully awake.
Love it.
It was so good. Thank you so much for being here. It really was an honor to have you.
You're welcome. It was so fun.
Thanks. Thank you for tuning into the Medical Disruptor. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to dig deeper, my book is the perfect place to start. You can find it on my website, drefratlamondre.com/book. And if you want more, you can find a whole bunch of free videos on the same website, drefratlamondre.com/courses. If you're interested in working with me one-on-one, please apply to my waiting list, also found there. And if you're a nurse practitioner looking for courses to level up your clinical confidence, visit my website at egprep.com. Don't forget to subscribe, share this episode, and leave a review. It helps us reach so many more disruptors like you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, keep disrupting.